There we go.
All right.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the metrics. We have a label called connection security policy that can be either unknown or mutual TLS. I think this field is super important for Ambient because it's essentially the only way you can tell that ztunnel is actually doing anything. When you deploy ztunnel, it's transparent, and so your application isn't changed. You can't like look for headers or something. You can maybe look for logs, but generally we kind of want ztunnel to be kind of this opaque thing that users don't really care about, right? They're probably not looking at logs in kube system often or doing TCP dumps on the node. However, in the current implementation in Istio, not Ambient, just in general in Istio, we actually only say that it's MTLS on the server side. The client always says unknown, even if it's doing MTLS. The reason, which goes back like many years, but apparently is that on the client side, one is that due to the implementation, we didn't actually know if we were doing MTLS or doing TLS to google.com, for example. That is kind of void now. We clearly know when we're doing HBone and when we're not, and can set this true or false. But the other argument is that as a client, you technically don't know if the server is verifying your TLS or not, because they could just have a function that says return true, right, instead of actually checking the certificate. I think that argument's not really compelling enough to intentionally set unknown, because on the inverse side, we also don't know if the other side's verifying. Like, you can't really know as either a client or server that both sides are verifying the TLS. But it doesn't really matter. Like, we can document this as like a weird caveat that mutual TLS doesn't mean that both sides verified, but just that both sides used TLS. It just seems like very pedantic, and that it's not worth putting unknown, which then is saying like, well, we can't be absolutely 100% sure they're verifying things, so we'll just treat this the same as if there wasn't any TLS at all. The users, I think, get confused by this. So my proposal basically is in HBone to always set MTLS when we're using MTLS with HBone.
Yeah, a quick question.
Oh, go ahead, Lynn.
Okay, thank you. A quick question. Thank you for opening this issue up. I actually ran into the same thing just a day ago. So a question for you, I guess I forgot to check, is do we actually report the correct connection security policy on the server side? Is this an unknown issue more related to just on the client side because we don't know the mutual TLS will be enforced?
Well, it's only the client, but I would argue that the server knows just as little as the client, right? Both ends only know that they verified the cert. They don't know the other side verified the cert. So I think the logic is inconsistently applied.
Okay. So we would report unknown on both right now?
No. Today, we report mutual TLS on the server, but unknown on the client. Otherwise, it would just always be unknown, right? And then the code would be entirely useless. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
Well, we do know, right, with the mutual TLS that the client and server requested the peer's cert.
Yeah, I have Quats said, and I couldn't find a way to do it. Otherwise, that it's hard to expose that in boring SSL. So we technically know, but we may not actually know.
Okay. We don't know. We don't know. It's not exposed by boring SSL.
All right. Well, we can take that up separately. And John, just when you say we're setting this value, you mean on telemetry and logs, right?
I believe it's only telemetry, actually.
Only in the metrics, right? In the metrics API.
In access logs, we don't actually have a field that says MTLS true or false.
We do on vendor extension and Stackdriver.
Oh, then does it behave this way as well with unknown on the client?
Yeah, data is always consistent.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we should probably fix that in logs as well, right?
We do technically have the SNI, which you can kind of...
If we change it to MTLS, we'll start reporting MTLS for TLS.
Because we don't... My suggestion is that we only do it for HBone. So...
Yeah, but if customer creates 1508 of TLS, how do you even know it's HBone or not?
Well, we send things... Just being on port 15,008 and being TLS does not mean they're HBone, right? HBone means that they've configured it to be HBone. Just like there's Istio NTLS and there's mutual TLS. Those are two different things in Istio.
Yeah, but my main argument is that I don't think we should create EC2 protocol here. If it's a general protocol, then you cannot tell.
So I don't think we're creating any protocol. I mean, I think HBone is secure by default, and it doesn't really matter if its client is sending certificates or not, so if it's MTLS or if it's TLS. And I don't even know if it matters with HBone if it's TLS or something else, or because in reality, what is the purpose really of this?
I think really what the user wants to know is, was my thing encrypted or not? The fact that we happen to put mutual TLS as a field, I don't think is ideal, because sure, maybe we don't know if it was mutual, but I don't think it's worth changing the name. I'd rather have a naming that's slightly imprecise that we can explain for people that really care about the precise details, like that's not 100% accurate, than say unknown and just leave them to figure it out themselves.
But John, is a constant. I mean, it's yes. The answer is yes. I mean, if you use HBone, it's secure.
Right.
It may or may not be MTLS. It may or may not be, and I don't know if even we should make a distinction. Too much.
So the intent constant is, okay, so I start my cluster, it's all disabled. Then I enroll Ambient, and maybe I do it namespace by namespace, right? Now I start seeing more and more mutual TLS pop up, and maybe once I'm done, everything's mutual TLS. That's still useful, right? It shows that we're migrating to MTLS. It shows that afterwards everything is encrypted. Even if it's constant in the steady state, it's still useful. And I think a lot of people will have kind of a mixed environment. Maybe they have multiple clusters and one doesn't have Ambient enabled, right? So they can see those are.
John, we already have it's in the request count and number of usage of HBone is a metric we support to other beans. So if it's HBone, it's secure. If it's not HBone, it may or may not be. I mean, we have it in Istio because we had this permissive mode and it was not clear what it is. But in HBone, there is no ambiguity.
This is how would you find if it's HBone other than this field? That's what I'm trying to convey with this label.
So the field should be empty.
HBone as a value.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think having HBone as a value is also an alternative good solution, right? So then they can determine it's much better than unknown, which is super confusing. Yeah. So if we tell them it's HBone, and then they can say, oh, HBone means mutual TLS. It has to be mutual TLS if the source and target both are HBone.
I mean, if we had a new field though, like this is an API that's used in Grafana and Kiali and Stackdriver, like all across Datadog, all these integrations, they'll have to all be, everyone's dashboard that uses Istio will need to be updated for this. Like
that's inevitable of Ambient. I mean, they will have to update it anyway, so waypoints and stuff.
Yeah,
but the metrics don't necessarily need to change, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And also keep in mind these metrics they are going to work on Istio 1.16 and now Ambient 1.17. So, it will be hard for them to do version specific change for us.
I think Lei has his hand up and may want to say exactly the same thing I want to say. So Lei,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so my point is if for HBone, the server side is always only allowing the mutual MTLS, we can claim mutual MTLS. If it also allow TLS, then maybe we probably just vaguely say, this is TLS, basically meaning encrypted, but not necessarily authenticating the client. But that depends on the implementation of HBone. If it's really only the MTLS only at the server side, then it must, because the plain text and the TLS are not allowed.
Yeah, unfortunately, you didn't see what I wanted to say, so I have to. We have discussions about adopting OpenTelemetry, and we have discussions about simplifying also the telemetry side of Istio. I mean, to resolve the high cardinality and a lot of other issues. The MTLS, the mutual TLS, and what we have done in the past, I don't think it's relevant anymore. And for Ambient, we should be able to, kind of cut some of the dimensions to reduce the cardinality, and maybe start adopting the OpenTelemetry naming. And so if we want, and unavoidable, we'll have dashboards to modify a bit for Ambient. If they do, they should modify to, something that is more sane and simpler.
Yeah, I agree with adopting the OpenTelemetry naming conventions, the field in OpenTelemetry. Yeah.
Did anyone do research in finding out what the field is? I mean, they already standardize a lot of attributes.
Sean, I think, is having a talk about the OpenTelemetry and naming conventions, the field labels. I can check with, looping Sean to this discussion.
And I think we're engaged with them, and if something is missing, we can work with them so all vendors adopt something. But I don't think it will be MTLS. It will be secure, maybe. Because, again, we don't want to hard code MTLS in any way.
Yeah, I don't think they have connection metrics defined. They only have HTTP and some other things.
I think they have some TCP, and again, they get expanding. The point is like with Gamma to have a multi-vendor metric standard.
Yeah, John, is this metric or does this metric exist regardless HBone is used?
Yeah, this is an existing metric. I'm only proposing changing it with HBone for backwards compatibility and implementation reasons.
Okay. Yeah. So the actual thing known on both the server side and the client side is that it's using TLS, right? Not mutual TLS.
Sure. Yes, I'm in complete agreement that the naming's bad. The reason I'm suggesting we keep the naming is because I think it's good enough and it avoids an API change. And we can caveat in documentation the precise meaning of the word and what it entails from a client and server perspective.
I feel like it's going to add support burden because we're going to have customers confused or people who have to support confused because it says MTLS, but it's HBone.
I think it's far more likely they're confused when it says it's unknown.
Yeah.
No, I agree. For backward compatibility, I think I don't mind having this, but I think moving forward, we should deprecate it and not recommend it and kind of have it just as a migration or until the dashboards. I mean, not remove it before its replacement is ready, but we seriously need to consider, improving the telemetry story
Yeah.
So can we have both, right? And we can keep this for backwards compatibility, and then if there's any other new field we need to add for adopting the OpenTelemetry specification, we can add those to indicate it's mutual TLS.
I hope that we don't add all the OpenTelemetry attributes because each attribute has a huge cost in Prometheus. So we already have like 20 labels. So I think it's already pretty excessive. I'd be pretty worried about adding more.
No, not adding, replace. I mean, a user can opt into OpenTelemetry mode, and if they opt into OpenTelemetry mode, this goes away.
You're right. If someone wants to make a new mode that instead of each request total, it's OpenTelemetry.http request with all their names or whatever, you can opt into. That seems like a reasonable future path, but I don't think it should prevent
not
any.
as the default.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we should keep for the current compatibility mode. We should definitely do what you're suggesting. I don't think it's so confusing, but we need to start a discussion about switching to OpenTelemetry because, again, it's a standard that's used in a lot of places. And when we switch, we should switch completely and again, maybe discuss use access logs for telemetry. There are all kinds of other discussions that are perfect for Ambient because it's, we know what. Why?
Yeah, just for these metrics, can we say, because we don't really know mutual TLS, can we say just do not use mutual TLS value, but only use the TLS and the plain text and unknown?
Our concern was adding a new value is effectively adding a new API.
Yeah, and dashboard. I mean, if the argument is dashboard, you need to keep working. I agree. I mean,
yeah, and the existing use of MTLS is just as problematic. So it seems inconsistent to. They should either both be TLS or they should both be they should both be the same.
Well,
whatever we call
we
them.
can change the vendor extension. I don't think we have to be. I mean, the cardinality problem is a problem for the Prometheus and Grafana pipeline, but other pipelines do not suffer from this issue. So we can easily change, say, Stackdriver option because it doesn't have the same issue.
Oh, it has the same issue. I mean, Stackdriver also has similar costs based on how much you store and.
So we can document saying mutual TLS now automatically becomes TLS. Does that work? Because we know that mutual TLS is not accurate.
I don't know what that means by mutual TLS becomes TLS.
Yeah, so if the existing value server value is multi-TOS, we automatically treat it as a TOS, basically to migrate to the new values.
Who treats it
Well,
like I don't know what that means?
Well, it degrades the value on the server because the server will actually do check for the server request insert. So it kind of makes the server value less precise, but I think that's reasonable too.
Yeah, this sounds fine for me too. Just add a caveat in the doc saying here MTLS means TLS, and it's for backward compatibility. We keep this name. I mean, keep this field.
Okay.
Okay, but it is mutual TLS, right? If the server side also does TLS.
If the server side authenticate client certificate, then it's a mutual TLS. But if the server side saying, sure, we just encrypt the connection use TLS, but I don't authenticate your certificate, then it's just TLS. But yeah.
So I guess I'm trying to think through as a user, how would they tell if it's mutual TLS? Because now we're saying, okay, you can check this mutual TLS right in the field, but that actually means it's TLS when they read the doc. So now the question is, how do they really check if it's mutual TLS?
Yeah, and so the issue is that as a client, all I know is if I verified, and as a server, all I know is if I verified. We can't know both ends because I don't know what verification you're doing. And mutual TLS, I believe, includes verifies as part of the definition. So if you, in 99.99% of the cases, if you see mutual TLS on either end, it means it was mutual TLS. In an obscure case where you have this being server or client, or maybe they're a third-party one that doesn't like security, maybe that's not true, in which case, hopefully, you would see a mismatch where one end reports unknown and one end reports mutual TLS, because we have both ends of the telemetry, right?
John, that is fine for endpoints that are fully inside the mesh, but our extensions operate on paths that go inside and out, and also can initiate TLS and also terminate regular TLS. So now what are we going to report there?
That is why I'm only suggesting we do this for HBone, not for regular TLS.
So meaning ingress is not affected, and inside the mesh we only use H1, which is MTLS, and we know that both server and client authenticate the other end, so it's really MTLS. And for ingress, we keep what we have today because that's not going to H1, so it's not impacted. I don't think H1 even supports plain TLS. I mean, I don't think with the Z-tunnel you can make a connection without certificate. It will not go through.
So in our data path, we don't distinguish between HBone and regular handling. We treat it sort of on the same pipeline.
We know from in the cluster, we know this is, the cluster is literally named HBone initiate. Why? What other info do we need?
So the thing is, people can inject into clusters called HBone terminate or HBone initiate. How do we trust something that's just named something?
The control plane sends a cluster that says HBone initiate, TLS context, use TLS, telemetry, say it was MTLS. If a user wants to lie and use an envoy filter to remove that and add one that says, like, they can insert telemetry on their own too if they're trying to do crazy things, right? It's like telemetry is secured, and I can't go spin up a random pod that says I sent a bunch of requests with MTLS.
Well, I still think it's hard to find what is HBone versus not HBone based on just, if you give me an XDev config from Envoy, how do I tell it's HBone or not, right? You can't. You have to basically trust something from the control plane.
No, we can tell. I mean, the control plane can say, for these TLS things, report is TLS or report not.
But let's not worry about a short transition. I mean, once we launch HBone, presumably a lot of people switch to HBone, and that will be the only case, and we don't have to worry about any other, kind of migration confusion. I mean,
yeah, I mean, on the same, if the control wants to say, for this particular data path, always report HBone regardless what you see on the data path, I'm fine with that. But I mean, it's clearly different than what we do now. So we just need to make sure it's not confused in any way.
Yeah, for the transition period, yes, it will be a bit of confusion, but there will be other confusion much bigger than this one when we migrate from sidecars to HBone. But long term, I mean, 1 year from now, we'll not have to worry about this, and I think it's reasonable to keep.
Yeah. So I think Quat is asking, is there any value on the metrics to indicate to user whether, in addition to mutual TLS or TLS, whether user wants to know if it's a classical mutual TLS was edge-born?
And for H1, there is no such thing as classical TLS.
Right. I mean, classical mutual TLS is what was sidecar mode, right?
Yeah.
So is there any value for user if user wants to, visualize their metrics to figure out, okay, these are my classical Istio traffic using classical Istio mutual TLS. These are the edge-born ones, which I'm already migrate to Ambient.
Yeah, there is definitely value, but the value is actually for identifying, as you said, how much is migrated to H1, how much is migrated is still in sidecar. That's really what you want to know. The fact that you know that everything that is migrated to H1 is MTLS, so we don't need to make 10 different things that shows that how much is moved to MTLS and all the wonderful properties of H1.
Okay.
It's H1 versus port 15008 versus everything else. That's good indication. Probably we have it. I think we have by port.
I think I would suggest that we make that distinction driven by config from control plane, so it's more explicit than naming. So for the telemetry filter on the H-bound data path, it just explicitly says report secure. That's all. Right, and then we don't look at data path.
Yep, I agree. All right. Thanks, everyone. I put a note of what we discussed on there. Feel free to comment if you think I captured it wrong. Shall we move on?
Second one is also yours.
Okay. It's not really fully finished yet, but given we just happen to have the meeting today, I figured I would present what we have now and get some early feedback. So just for preamble, this has no user-facing impact necessarily, so don't be freaked out if you see obscure things that look weird. So today, a request between two Z tunnels, we send to the pod IP on port 15,008, and then we have some redirection logic we'll actually bump that over to the server Z tunnel, right? The main reason we did this was on the server side, we need to know what the intended destination is during the TLS handshake so that we can serve the correct certificate. There's not many options for how we can convey that, either the destination IP or some, I don't know, ALPN hack or something, or SNI. And we didn't use SNI primarily because, one, it doesn't allow IP addresses, which is obviously what we want to put in the SNI as part of the RFC, and most libraries will actually reject it as well, as last I checked. And the main reasons that we were considering doing the SNI was to simplify the redirection, so that we didn't need this redirect from calls to the server to the Z tunnel. That to me wasn't very convincing because we still do need that redirect for plain text requests to the server. So when the client doesn't have a Z tunnel, so we can enforce policies, bump it to the waypoint, do whatever we need to do. So that's why we didn't do it, or that's why we did it that way at the time. But I think now some of the circumstances have changed a bit, so I think it's worth revisiting. I'll pause if there's any questions. Okay, yeah, so the main two things that have changed is, one, I think we found a reasonable format to encode the info we want in the SNI. And the other is that we've also, I think, found some use cases where it could be useful. If you can scroll down to the design, Francis. So I'll start with the format, which is part 3 of this. So we can receive either request to services or to pods. For services, there's already kind of well-known names for each VIP. So, my service.my namespace service.cluster.local could be the SNI. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, this may not even be, well, that would be relevant only for waypoints. A server-side Z-tunnel doesn't get request to VIPs. It only gets request to pod IPs. And then the direct to workload was a more problematic one. But it turns out that Kubernetes actually does have a naming format for pods. They happen to insert these in the cluster DNS. We don't technically care it's DNS. We just want a format that's at least arguably standardized. And so that looks like the ip.namespace.pod.cluster.local. The pod is a constant, not the pod name. There's also IPv6, which is the same thing. Basically, just all the dots or colons are replaced with dashes. So that would be the format we'd use. The kind of extra use case would be doing SNI routing at an east-west gateway. We could use this info to kind of do similar routing that we do with Envoy today. It'd be slightly different because it would be aware of kind of the next hop for the request. And that's, I split that out into this other doc, which I worked on at the same time, but we can discuss that too. That's pretty much the main thing, I think. I might have missed some important details here. Any questions or thoughts?
For the ones that are using the IP address, will this IP address suddenly change due to some, IP address change, as in making this like outdated when you use that as part of SNI name?
It is possible, but note that we're going from before and after we were still conveying the IP address. We're just conveying it in a different format now, so that doesn't really change at all with this proposal.
Okay.
For the mappings that need to be maintained in memory, is there any potential that a given actor could maintain only a subset of the mapping? As in not need to know every IP address across the entire cluster, but only for a large service, only know a handful of the endpoints?
Sure. So in order to be an effective client today, you already need to know the identity of everything you want to call. Otherwise, you're not able to verify from TLS, right?
Mm-hmm. And
identity already includes the namespace as part of it. So they should already have this information for workloads. For services, it's a bit different, but in order to resolve a service VIP to a concrete IP address, they already need info about that service. So to add just one string value for the host name doesn't seem terribly onerous, right? They already need the VIP imports and IPs under that VIP mapping.
Okay.
Quat?
I think the natural question is why not go all the way and put service account? What's the value of this intermediate step?
Yeah, so if you go down to the very bottom, I address this because I thought about this after you mentioned this last night. Could you scroll down, Francis? I forget why I didn't like it. Let's see. Oh yeah, so for Z-tunnel and waypoints, this does work pretty well because all we use for the SNI is deciding what certificate to serve, and so we can determine that based on the service count, and that's fine. And then of course we could add a check that the actual destination in the IP address is within that service account, so they don't send us some bogus like, oh yeah, give me the foo service account and I want to actually request bar. So that's no problem. The issue is that it would break the multi-network forwarding through SNI. But that doc is also super work in progress, and I don't think anyone's looked at it other than me and Costin. So if we don't do what I'm proposing there, then this may become a viable option again. But for like a one-line summary of like that doc is like we look at the SNI and then we decide where to go next. So with the service count, we don't know where to go next.
Right. I mean, I understand there are issues, but
yeah.
What's our long-term goal here? What do we want HBON to look like? Do we want to have SNI include the actual destination IP or something identity-based?
Ethan, you are first. Go ahead.
Yeah, what's the right, similar question to Quat, what's the right level of specificity? Like, should the protocol specify that you use the IP or you use the service account? Or should the protocol just specify that SNI is populated? And in our implementation, we can kind of do what works well for now, that we have
yeah,
options
I mean,
to
you
extend it.
need the client and the server to agree, and so I'm assuming that anyone using this is going to have at least one part, like either a standardized server or a standard client. If they have a completely custom thing, they can do whatever they want.
Ethan, to answer it slightly differently, I mean, forget about Kubernetes and Istio and HBON. In the internet, you know, using certificate has been done for a very long time, and they're very well-known practices. You know, IP cannot be used because the standard doesn't allow IP in SNI, unfortunately, and mangling it is kind of a hack that is probably nobody else is doing. Normally, it's either a service name or a host name. Actually, host name is the most common. And for pods, host name is actually the pod ID, which we use for other purposes, and it's super useful to have because it avoids all the IP reuse problems. Because IP is not very reliable identity. Pod ID is a reliable identity. So I really like this proposal because it moves HBON close to the internet standards where you actually use the host name, which, you know, in case of pod is a pod ID .namespace .whatever, and if it's a address to a service, it's a service ID, and then you can do some mappings and you know, populate with the right thing if it's a service.
But why not actually do pod ID versus pod IP? Well, did I lose everyone?
No, it was still
Nope.
here.
Oh,
Just maybe custom.
I said why not actually do pod ID instead of pod IP?
What? Sorry, pod what?
Like, I think Brown's proposal was to embed pod IP in the SNI. Why not actually embed a hostname based on pod ID?
Pod ID,
Doesn't that also...
pod ID is what I'm proposing.
The reason that I didn't do that initially is so one, that we have a nice property that the current IP format is unique within a names or within a network. If we switch to ID, it's only unique within a cluster. And the second thing is that you would need, so any client should have the IP in the namespace already anyways, but they would not necessarily have the name. So it's kind of weird. Like, you don't ever address, like, for clients to need to know a server pod's name is not something that's common in Kubernetes. It's kind of just an opaque identifier that only the server side really cares about. It could work though.
Pod ID solves the concern about IP reuse.
I don't think it really does, because if you think about how the end-to-end flow comes, the client ztunnel is going to get an IP address anyways, and then it would reverse that IP into an IE and then send it over. So it's just moving it from the server to the client, but that seems largely, it doesn't seem that much difference.
The replay attack, right? You cannot replay the same communication if a pod reuses it. There's not a chance that IP and ID are the same, you know, after some time.
But using IPs, I mean, in SNI is, again, nobody does it. I like to avoid hacks and things that are, again, Istio only and are not invalid things. Hostname is universal. I don't think anyone would have a problem or anyone would not support it.
There's no, the hostname could be foo, like literally foo with no qualifications. Every pod in the match could have the same hostname foo. It's there's no standard. It has to be uniquely identifiable, and there's no standard uniquely identifiable hostname.
No. The standard is if I take hostname on a pod, I get this hello-xxxyy.
Right, but that is by default. It's just a pod name, so it's not namespaced, so it's not very useful. And it can be overridden to be completely arbitrary. So yeah, every pod could say that they're foo, and now ztunnel gets a request to foo, and what does it do?
I think it is reflected, so we know. I mean, if it's overwritten, we know, and we can send exactly what the host name is. So we can maintain the guarantees that it's always matching the host name plus namespace, which is available actually.
In multi-cluster, the IP may have the same IP. The pods may have the same IP, unless you specify use disjoint IP space.
Yeah, so
just
like
something.
IP overlap is something that we solve by network. So an IP address is only relevant within a single network. When we traverse, we know which network we're going to and which network we're coming from.
Well, that needs to be reflected in SNI, because if we do routing, and I mean, it's a bit more complicated with if it's not really. I mean, Lay is right.
Well, I mean, if we don't ever hop between multiple networks on a single request, right? So
We don't support going to a specific pod with current implementation, but that's a major limitation of multi-network today.
yeah, I mean, I guess if an east-west gateway gets a request of 1, 2, 3, 4, it would assume that it's in its own network. I suppose if it's somehow forwarded again to another network, we would have lost the intended network. Kind of ugly. Louis?
Yeah, I was going to make, like, it seems like the key decision point here is how we want east-west gateways to work.
Yeah.
And whether we want direct pod addressing through an east-west gateway or not. Clearly, the east-west gateway, if you want direct pod addressing, right, service account isn't going to cut it, right? Right. Particularly if you want the east-west gateway to route, or the east-west. The other problem, by the way, with the east-west gateway, or in fact any trusted man in the middle, right? The service account mechanism doesn't work for trusted man in the middle, right? So like there's an admin gateway that's going to do packet interception, and it's going to be able to terminate MTLS in the handshake, and the client's going to trust it because it's in a whitelisted or allow listed ACL, right? For known trustable service accounts that have superpowers. So I think we can rule service account out for that reason. Then the second question is, what do we actually use, and does it have to be multi-network capable or not? Most of the basic Kubernetes and CA infrastructure out there is going to want to issue, they're going to issue certificates to pods, and they're going to put the cluster local pod ID into either the common name or a SAN. Right? They may put the network in as an attribute into the certificate, but it's going to be pretty hard to persuade people to be fully multi-network in the CA infrastructure, right? If you use IPv6, you could probably address your multi-network name collision problems, right, by partitioning your IPv6 namespace, even if they weren't physically reachable. We know we'll run into collisions with IPv4 in multi-network. I think we could probably still make SNI work for that, but I think we need to have a little bit more detail in the design, John. So in general, I think the pattern is right. I think it's just it's a naming convention for, right, the mechanism that exists today for the host name, right, for pods is just a way of generating a unique pod ID, right? That's network addressable, but not necessarily stable.
Right.
We're not, I don't think we want to use UUIDs.
Well, UUIDs are not server names. That's the whole point of server name indicator, is that it's a name of the server that it's supposed to be, identifying the servers are unique enough. So I don't know.
All right, so we've ruled out service account, but we still need to pick the name. Is that fair?
And we could make a new format that is the pod name dot namespace.
But what is wrong with what I suggested, which is actually the host name, whatever, I mean, the actual pod ID, because that would ensure that we know exactly what pod it is.
You said two things. You said host name and then pod ID, Costin.
No, host name is pod ID. That's what host name is.
That's what I'm trying to say, is that it's not. So,
what do you mean it's not?
You can set an arbitrary host name.
Yeah, but then you override it. But by default in Kubernetes, it's a pod ID, and I don't think anyone. And if you override it, you are supposed to respect the RFCs, which says that each host needs to have a unique name in a network.
That's not said anywhere in the Kubernetes docs. That
no, but in RFC it is written. I mean, when in the best practice for internet is when you set host names, they need to be unique. I mean, that's.
So when someone sets up a cluster and every pod's host name is foo, what do we do? Right? Why not just use the pod? Why not just use the pod name? Like, what value is using host name that by default is the pod name, but then they can override it to be broken.
We can find out how many people. Okay, you can find out how many people are overriding, and we can find out how many are overriding to non-unique names. And I think priority should be given to internet standards, not to what bad configurations people may have.
Francis, can you scroll up in the document again? Up to the format.
One sec. Here or above?
No, I think this is probably fine right there. So the direct to workload name, right, only contains the namespace. It doesn't contain the pod name, right, John?
Yeah, no pod name.
Yeah, so that sucks. Right, that's bad.
What I was suggesting is we replace the IP part with the pod name, if we want to go with pod name as. And it is an invented format, but it's maybe what we want.
What is there prior art for fully qualified pod name? Is it just some UUID like thing?
Yeah, from everything I've seen in Kubernetes, it will be a struct that has like UID, name, and namespace. I don't know if I've seen a format that includes all of them. I mean, maybe like namespace / name is used in a lot of places, but I don't think you can have a / in SNI.
Right. If the UUID is stable in time, that's probably the right thing. Right, custom, because you could address it over 2 different networks, right? And so the ip.namespace.pod.cluster. Doesn't really work very well. Pod name,
but
including a UUID like component, namespace whatever, is stable.
But the pod ID is also unique. I mean, it's not if
sorry, what custom say pod ID without defining what pod ID is?
Pod ID is a combination of the deployment name dash a hash of the deployment ID, which is not repeated, and then a hash that is identifying the pod. So it's always unique and not reused and Kubernetes because it's also.
So we're saying the same thing then.
You are saying UUID format, which is a 64-bit.
No. Like it has a stable in time component, right? That is non-colliding.
The pod ID is definitely not colliding because when you call Kubernetes to get the pod specifications, that's the ID use. When you debug and do istio-cattle PS, that's a pod ID use. Istio-cattle PS shows the pod IDs.
So we need to know if the pod UID is attackable.
The guarantee is that UID is unique within a cluster. I don't know if it's unique across clusters, though.
There's no guarantee that it's not either, right? But the allocator is probably local.
Yeah, that's my guess, but it doesn't say in the doc.
I would add the cluster name in the domain part as well. I mean, to make sure that we cover multi-network, multi-cluster, everything. It's not bad to have the cluster. Since the domain name is actually under our control because it's.
But it could be same trust domain, right?
Yeah, no, trust domain is fine.
Too. Like, how do you differentiate cluster 1 and 2 who happen to have the same UID but also use the same trust domain?
Well, so you can either put a requirement on, hey, if you're using multi-cluster infrastructure, you better make sure your UIDs, not UUIDs, are non-colliding, which you probably want for a variety of other reasons that have nothing to do with us, right? Like telemetry and debugging and logging and those other things, right? Just if you have multi-cluster Kubernetes and you're not using Istio today, how are you telling the difference between 2 pods?
How can you tell a user to do that?
Yeah, that's my question too. It's right, easy, Louis.
Maybe, right. Well, there's people out there who provide multi-cluster machinery, and there are people who are just stitching together a bunch of disconnected Kubernetes clusters. So we should go talk to the machinery people.
yeah, I mean, if you look at, I think, oh, sorry, Costin put in chat about, suffixing with a cluster name. I know that Kubernetes just removed cluster name from their spec, but that doesn't mean that, I mean, in this case, like if you as a user are managing a fleet of Kubernetes clusters, right, you can't guarantee that the API server is going to give a UUID that's unique across all of those, but you can at least guarantee that you name those uniquely across, let's say, regions or whatever, or else you're going to be in a whole department of trouble of your own. So I think that is a fair assumption to make across, if you're talking about a fleet rather than a single cluster, if you add the cluster name into the ID.
Yeah. I think I like it. And also I think UUID is not straightforward. People have to do calculation from UUID to pod name, which is actual work for them too. Like if a pod name within a namespace is already unique, we could just use the pod name.
It's the one thing it's not unique is across time. So UID is guaranteed even across time, which may be more secure.
But John, UUID, a proper UUID, I think is a non-starter because it's never used in SNO. I mean,
hold on. Kubernetes is specifically, they say in their documentation, they're using UUID.
For SNI and for host names?
No, for their synthetic pod IDs.
Yeah.
Use UUID.
Yeah, but that's still a host name with domain name and everything else. I mean,
you can format it into a host name. Like, let's right.
So
what we care about is it unique across clusters and is it unique in time? Well, if it's a UUID, it's absolutely unique in time.
What I care about is a name to include namespace and to include some suffix that can be configured.
Sure, like we're in agreement. Like it should include the pod name, it should include the namespace, right? Those are just structural parts of the format.
Yeah.
So I think we're all fine with that. It's can we meet the uniqueness requirement by just reusing what Kubernetes is already giving us, or do we have to layer something in on top? And that's going to create headaches because that's going to make us do things with CAs.
I mean, if we are okay with IP address and not concerned about IP reuse, I don't think uniqueness is as a strong requirement as it sounds. I mean, it's.
I'm pretty sure their existing mechanism is going to beat out the IPv4 for collision. They say they're using UUID. Do we how long is it exactly? But if they're using UUID, it should be 128 bits.
It's long.
It's a 64-bit.
Yeah, real long.
128 UUID is typically 128, and
right. So that's gonna be that like IPv6 for collision, right?
Yeah, but
and it's structurally designed not to collide, right? Algorithmically designed not to collide.
But I don't think we have that strong requirements for the SNI. It's a too high standard.
We do in if it doesn't collide across network, we do.
But
if we want to do we have to put the cluster in. We have to put the cluster in anyway. So doesn't that solve our cross cluster? Because it does collide across clusters without adding an explicit cluster name to it.
So namespace, cluster name, and network and the domain in general is super important because we also want to map it to DNS at some point. And
does it actually collide across clusters in practicality, John? It's UUID.
I mean, it's very long, so probably not, but I don't know if there's any guarantees of that.
Yeah. Right, so we're in the does it matter category.
Yeah.
I mean, you just said it, that the important part about the UUID is that it gives us guaranteed uniqueness. So why when we go to multi-cluster are we saying we're okay with potentially non-guaranteed uniqueness?
So it depends how they initialize it, right? That's what we need to know. Right, so it's a very implementation detailed specific piece of information that we need. If when you bootstrap the cluster, they generate and they do a good job of generating a random number, that's the bootstrap for the UUID. The odds of colliding in space across many, many clusters in a single mesh are vanishingly low. If they do a shitty job bootstrapping the UUID, right, then those probabilities go up. if other parts of Kubernetes are taking a no collision in space dependency in multi based on the UUID, it may be reasonable for us to do that too.
As far as I can tell, looking at their implementation, there's nothing that's like checking that it's even unique within its own cluster. It's just generating a random each time.
Right, so we're not going to find the answer in the documentation. Right?
Yeah, I'm looking at the documentation of the Go library that they use and how they use it.
So they probably use the standard Go UUID library,
So,
and then they bootstrap it from something.
Yeah, it says there's 1 in a couple of few trillion chance of collision or something.
but John, it's guaranteed to be unique because that's the ID used in Kubernetes API. So when you do Kubernetes API, you talk with the API server, in the URL, you put that ID. So you cannot have two things because, again, the API server will not allow it.
Yeah, no, so we know it doesn't collide in space in a Kubernetes.
Yeah, and in time, it's less.
The only question is, can we make, right, if they're relying on UIDs, like algorithmic, like probabilities to make the stipulation, can we make the same stipulation for multi-cluster? Because multi-cluster is just a bigger version of single cluster. The only reason that it could happen, is more likely to occur in multi-cluster is if they did a bad job with Bootstrap.
But that being said, with this being so implementation specific, we have to keep in mind that there are likely many implementations of this logic, not just what we see in open source.
Well, I don't think so, actually, Mitch. Not many. I don't know of many Kubernetes implementations that are not using the API server.
Right, but like, for instance, Google's would be a forked version of the API server rewritten.
Yeah, but I don't think we fork this, right? So we have to go talk to the people in the know.
Okay.
But
like that's very clearly what we have to do.
The protocol is fixed, actually. The way we refer to a pod using this, namespace v1, pods slash, and with the ID fixed. And for multi-cluster, we have the suffix must be different if we want to distinguish, because we want to use this information for DNS and for other purposes. It cannot be just the pod ID naked.
Okay.
So what about virtual machines? So those are not. I mean, those have identities.
All virtual machines have a host name. I mean, and if you want to talk with using DNS, they must be unique, because otherwise you cannot. I mean, the DNS doesn't work. If you want to SSH to a machine by name, how do you do it?
Well, so I think
it has to have its own
a
IP.
fair research project here, Ethan, would be to go look at how specific cloud infrastructures, when they generate a certificate for a workload identity for a VM, what do they look like?
It's a UUID. If I just did it the other day. If you ask the metadata service for their JOT, it's a UUID. It's a globally unique ID. I don't know that is over all time, but it is definitely over space.
Yeah. Okay. So that aligns then with the choice to use pod ID here.
Yeah.
So all we're trying to now assess is the probability of collision in space.
But the probability of collision is zero, assuming, well, the probability is zero assuming you use a cluster suffix, or are we trying to avoid that?
It depends. It just depends on the mechanism of Bootstrap, right?
I don't think we have to avoid using the cluster suffix. There is nothing wrong. Actually, it's very good to use the cluster suffix and I mean, have namespace cluster.
Sure. Yeah, we can use that for it. But some people don't, right?
When we say pod ID, are we talking pod name or pod UUID or something else?
It's a hybrid.
Whatever kubectl get pods return, or is kubectl PS return.
So kubectl get returns the age of the pod, the number of times it's restarted. I don't think those are things we want to incorporate in ID.
Every pod has a UUID assigned to it by Kubernetes. I think that's all Costin's talking about.
And that's what we're talking about. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we can have a fully qualified form, which is uuid.podname.namespace.clustername.local. I think that's right. If somebody else says something like that.
Is there a point of disagreement still, or I can't tell if we've reached consensus and are still debating, or if there is still debate, what the debate is about. Like what do we need to know to make progress?
So I think the only thing is, if there's a high risk of collision in multi-cluster, right, then we need to come back and think about it. If there's a vanishingly low risk of collision in multi-cluster,
so
we're probably good.
John can verify this.
But you do it.
But if they're just using a random number to generate GUIDs, do we see any reason that there'd be a higher risk of collision in multi-cluster versus single cluster, other than there's just
constant
bots?
bootstrap? Right, you bootstrap with a poorly selected random number.
Okay.
But I don't think they have a shared. There's no shared state between API servers within a single cluster.
Right. So if they're not bootstrapping their UUID with PRNG,
yeah,
right, they're doing it wrong, or something equivalent to PRNG. Right, or they have a guarantee that some system is coordinating the bootstrap so that there's no collision in bootstrap in a multi-cluster environment. Either of those two is fine.
Yeah, I'll ask them.
Yeah, that's it.
But if we're adding namespace and cluster name, would the answer matter though? Because as long as it's unique within that cluster, then it should be okay, right? Even if I have two duplicate UID on different cluster, as long as I have unique cluster name.
Right. The point there, Lynn, was just not everybody is guaranteeing unique cluster names.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's what you guys were debating. Yeah, I lost that point. Yeah,
Like
which
I just
think
literally
it's
go and
stupid.
create two Kubernetes clusters on some VMs. Like I spin up two kind clusters and I put them into a mesh. I didn't bother naming them.
Yeah, and I remember seeing GKE allow that too. Now that I think about it, yeah, you could have two same cluster name. Okay.
Yeah, lots of people create multi-cluster meshes out of pre-existing clusters. So.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, by the way, one
you don't
point
have to name the mesh. I mean, that's a configuration option you pass to Istio, right? That exists today. You already have to name an Istio mesh.
Yeah.
That doesn't have to be a property of the cluster or the compute. Like that can be a property of a config, which is something that Istio already supports today.
Mm.
Right, but if we're using a CA infrastructure, let's say there's a CA infrastructure that's providing workload identity before somebody uses Istio, what would the CA be doing? And if we wanted to reuse it, they would not take a dependency on our naming.
Yeah, the suffix need to be customizable for sure. And user should obviously include, or by default, should include whatever information need, including cluster if they have multiple clusters. And I think
anyway, I think we're in general agreement. Yeah. We have some details to figure out. So John has some AI.
Yeah, I have a question as well. One thing in the domain fronting, different SNI and authority header is something that some load balancers reject. I don't know, some people don't like it. I think the gateway API has said you can't do this using the gateway API. Do we care?
Sorry, can you repeat? What is
domain fronting using
what is
different SNI for as the authority header? Basically, my understanding is that in order to get around firewalls, people in China would set their SNI to some bogus value all the time, and then the actual destination they want is in the host header, and they would use that as firewall circumvention. And then I don't know how the history, but somehow they convinced a bunch of people that this was a terrible thing and that those fields should always match. And I think Google load balancer, maybe. I think I definitely saw Azure load balancer, like they actually reject this.
So the solution to this was ECH, not SNI, right? And I think we're restricting HBone to TLS 1.3 effectively. So we're not. I don't think we're really using old school SNI, right? In ECH, the indicated server name is encrypted.
But
right, and this was to right. This is what's causing the Great Firewall of China to block all quick traffic, and often to block all HTTP2 traffic. But the internet community adopted ECH to help people get around the Great Wall of China. So there's an ongoing war there.
But on this topic, since we are having this discussion and controversy, we should also consider putting these names that we put in SNI into the list of SANs as a URL, as a domain SAN, and that will avoid many confusion and interaction. Because I think what John mentioned is based on the fact that certificate you're asking for one SNI, and then you get a different thing as a certificate.
Well, so I don't think we want to rely on the host header, right, for certificate selection. Right.
Not rely on it. We still
no. We can do certificate verification, and we can do hostname verification against certificate, but that's not part of the handshake custom, right? Because you may handshake and then send nothing.
True, but the cert should include this information as well. So you ask SNI.
Sure, but let's separate the two. Right now we have a handshake problem.
Yeah.
Right. So I think the answer here, John, is we should be doing ECH.
Okay, I need to look into that more, but a brief suggestion says that they actually block this in each ECH somehow. I don't understand how, but I'll look into it.
All right, you chat with Piotr about this. So, yeah, I mean, it's a little, I don't remember all the details off the top of my head, but it exists to allow for certificate selection by the server in a way where the client can indicate it without being observed.
But inside the mesh, we don't have this problem. And for external gateways, probably we need to do all kind of other tweaks. Like we use post instead of
yeah, we may have to support SNI and do
use other kind of SNIs. Yes, so I don't think external gateway and infrastructure is really something that we
have to tolerate working with TLS 1.2.
Yes.
Or yeah, or TLS 1.3, but without ECH. I think our default should probably be with ECH. But John, go talk to Piotr about it. He is definitely an expert on this. So.
Okay, so it sounds like I didn't see any disagreement to using SNI and sending to ztunnel, just disagreement on what we put in the SNI. Is that accurate?
Oh yeah, no, using SNI is definitely something we must do. I don't think there is any argument against it.
Yeah, can I ask a quick question? What's the impact for the sidecar for this proposal? Does this mean 1/16 sidecar is not going to interoperate with Ambient anymore?
Probably, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll just update it. I mean,
so they would have to move to 1/17 in order to interoperate with Ambient because we changed the contract, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't expect anyone to be able to, like, when they adopt Ambient, they should update their sidecars to the latest version and then start adopting Ambient.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a caveat we have to keep in mind because we kind of tell people 1/16 potentially, but now it's not with this change.
Yeah,
at some point we'll freeze it, but not now.
I would also appreciate, I've linked on there a couple times the multi-network Ambient doc that's about multi-network routing. That would be useful to get some early reviews on as well.
Yeah, we'd love to. Thank you, John. Okay, I think we're out of time. Next week, we probably should have Mitch's agenda go first because I feel bad that Mitch, you're supposed to go today and somehow it wasn't on.
Mitch's
So we
agenda
forgot.
wasn't on the agenda until.
Yeah, it was from last week because we couldn't finish it up. So let's make sure we got to Mitch the first item next week. Yep.
Let's do this. Okay. Right on. Thank you, folks.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Talk to you later. Take care.